Stop rogue banks interrogating, debanking customers. And what about Dan? War propaganda in overdrive. Coming up on the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 4th of June 2025. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party writer Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's show, we're going to be talking about the latest bad behaviour by the banks, which is, well, that's a never-ending story, but we're going to highlight one part of it, which has become a bigger and bigger problem in recent times, and how the banks are off the reservation, really. They claim they're following the law, but they're not. And we're going to cover a couple of different pieces of war propaganda, and we're going to probably run short of time, but we're ambitious, so we'll see how we go. But there's been a real ramping up of war propaganda in the last few months, especially in relation to China, but of course also to justify the Israel-Gaza war in the Middle East. And we want to talk to you about how that propaganda works, so that people can detect it when they see it. But first, as you know, as we often say, this is not a show that's just for information. We talk about things we want to change, and we need your help to do that. And the way you can help is by helping to spread the show. Share the show around, get more eyeballs on it. You can do that by liking the show. So hit the like button, please. Do that straight away so you don't forget. Share it on social media as widely as possible. Subscribe if you're not a subscriber, and when you do subscribe, ring the bell icon, and that will allow you to be notified of what we do between shows and everything we post. Please comment. We value your feedback, and it's also good for the algorithm. You know, we live in a world where it's all about tricking algorithms. Well, Richard doesn't really live in that world very much, but
as little as I can get away with.
He's in the real world, but the modern world is increasingly about tricking algorithms. So the comments really help with that, and we need your financial support to do what we do. So there's a donate button below where you can help by making a donation. And let me say, it's the 4th of June, so we're coming up to the end of the financial year. And that is a good time to donate. Donations to political parties, like the Citizens Party, are tax deductible up to $1,500. And if you're going to pay tax, you may as well use some of that to donate to what we do, because we put it to much better use than some of the things the tax man does. Not all of it, some of the things are essential, but we can always sit here and talk about what gets wasted by the tax man. So please help us by doing that, right? It'll be really, really valuable. Given that it's post-election, what you would have noticed by the Citizens Party is we don't sit on our laurels. We've hit the ground running because we're determined to intervene on the political situation now. Some of the things that we're firing up include a campaign to force the government to conduct an inquiry into AUKUS, for instance. Because talking about wasted tax dollars.
Wasting taxpayers' money, yeah.
$368 billion, or now, according to John Lander, $374 billion is committed for that. And that's just crazy, right? So we're going to get Parliament to conduct an inquiry into that. And if Parliament refuses to, the Citizens Party will conduct an open inquiry into it, right? And make sure people see this for what it is. And one of our people in Western Australia, Aisha Novakovic, attended a Perth US Asia Centre event yesterday about AUKUS. And Perth US Asia Centre, Richard, as you point out, it's run by the Americans. It's an American influence operation in Australia. So the event was hosted by an American who heads that up. The main speaker was an American from Washington talking about how wonderful AUKUS is. And you know why? They're the ones making the money, right? These are like, you know the term carpetbaggers, you probably know this. This was the term applied to the businessmen from the northern states in America who went into the South after the Civil War to make money, and they happen to carry these carpet bags, right?
Literally, because they carry these samples of this, that, and the other.
And some of them would have been good people, but there's a whole bunch of con men among them, right? And that's why they got this bad reputation. These were just carpetbaggers in Perth yesterday, rubbing their head. Yeah, man, we're going to make so much money. You guys are going to have a great time with this thing called AUKUS that we're going to make so much money from. It was shameless, right? So we need to get an inquiry into that, expose it all, and get Australians to revolt against this garbage. And that's the sort of thing the Citizens Party leads on, and you can help by making a donation. That said, let's get into it, because we do want to squeeze a little bit into this show today and keep it under 20 minutes. No, it will be a bit longer than 20 minutes. All right. Stop rogue banks interrogating and debanking customers. We're going to run through a couple of examples here of what we're talking about. Now, plenty of people are on social media, Richard, so they would have seen some of these examples. One of them, most famously, started to happen a few weeks ago when a fairly well-known business analyst in Australia named Louis Christopher from SQM Research, which is real estate analysis, I believe, right? Or investment analysis that he does. Yeah. So his business is called SQM Research. And I've known of Louis Christopher for at least 6 years. Yeah. Right?
He's one of the go-to commentators for the media and so forth.
He's very, very well known. And if he's well known to the public, he's also well known to his bank.
One would think.
One would think. Now his bank is the Commonwealth Bank. And he made the news because he went public with the fact that he got a letter from the Commonwealth Bank demanding all this detailed information about his business, including, bizarrely, how much cash he keeps in his house and why. And it included a threat. And the threat was, if you don't answer these questions within 7 days, we could freeze your accounts and cut off doing business with you. And that threat is called debanking. Right, this is a term called debanking. I'm going to come back to Louis Christopher in a minute, but it's just a quick aside. We first heard about debanking in 2019. Well, I don't know if you heard about it before then, but I first heard about debanking in 2019, and it came up in the first hearing of the Senate inquiry into the Morrison government's bill to ban cash transactions over $10,000. And the Citizens Party helped to lead the fight against that bill, and we stopped it. We defeated the bill, and it was one of our biggest victories, actually, the defeat of the cash ban bill. We had a great sign: Liberal Party policy is to jail you for spending your own money, because if they had to pass that bill, that included criminal sanctions as well. So they had a hearing, and the hearing was beautiful. It was in December 2019, and a couple of senators, Rex Patrick and the late Senator Alex Gallagher, sat there all day, and Alex Gallagher especially. There was all these expert witnesses coming up to say why it was important to have this cash ban, remember? And he asked one question all day: where is the evidence that this is necessary? And witness after witness after witness, representing the government, representing Treasury, representing the Reserve Bank, representing the task force that had promoted
Black
this,
Economy
Task Force, representing AUSTRAC, the government agency that enforces anti-money laundering laws. None of them could provide the evidence that this was necessary, right? But one of the witnesses that was there to argue against the law actually mentioned in passing this thing called debanking, where the banks just cut off people having a bank account, just cut them off. And I was surprised, the senators were certainly surprised, Senator Patrick and Senator Gallagher. They said, what? Banks just they just stop you having a bank account? And they asked the obvious question. I mean, how can you transact in the modern economy? How can you function if you don't have a bank account? You can't. Now, you're as much of a wannabe hermit as anybody in Australia, Richard. Do you have a bank account?
Yeah, for a good few years
now. You have to. If anyone could survive without it, it's you. But you have one, right? So they said, why are banks doing this? And the first answer, and this is not the answer that applies today that we're going to be talking about. The first answer was, well, the banks say it's for reputational risk, and they debank businesses that have moral sort of concerns hanging over them, and the businesses, things like gun shops, adult stores, Bitcoin traders and bullion dealers, these sorts of things, right? But the gun shops in the adult stores, the vape stores. I think vapes are illegal now, but
they are now, but they weren't then. And
tobacconists, right?
Yeah, brothels.
Yeah,
which, people might have moral objections to some of this stuff, but go talk to your major parties who legalised them.
Exactly, they're legal businesses.
These are legitimate businesses under the law.
And I think it was Rex Patrick, if I remember right, I don't know if you remember better, who said, hang on, who are the banks? Who are the banks? This was 2019, the year after the Royal Commission. Who are the banks of all people to cast moral judgment on other businesses?
Yeah,
right.
I mean, I think the reputational risk should go the other way around. You're banking with CBA?
That's right.
Really?
That's right.
Except we got not much choice in the matter, the way the system's set up.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. So anyway, that was the first indication of this thing called debanking. And since then, we've had numerous cases come across our desk of businesses getting debanked. And the most common form of debanking is, apart from those, those ones they cast moral judgment on, is the types of businesses that are some form of competition to the banks. And that includes the Bitcoin dealers, that includes bullion dealers, people who sell you gold and silver bullion. Well, if your money's in bullion, it's not in the banks, and the banks don't like that. Yeah. It also includes remittance companies. Now, in places like where there's high ethnic populations in Australian cities, there's a lot of small, very nimble cash remittance companies that send money overseas really efficiently. And if you go to a major bank to do it, or the Western Union at the post office, you will pay a massive fee to send money overseas. These are companies that do it much cheaper, more efficiently. And if you're, say, a Lebanese Australian, Lebanon is one of those countries that actually relies on the money that's sent back by relatives overseas.
Yeah, because their currency collapsed several years ago and hasn't really recovered. Cyprus is another one. And also to point out, part of the government's visa program and the relations with the Pacific Island countries is centered around bringing them over here as workers so that they can remit part of their wage home to support their families where they come from. And now then the banks are just allowed to try and herd all of those people who can least afford it.
Exactly, to pay a massive fee.
To pay these fees when there's another company down the road that
will do it,
provided it has a bank account, can do it for a few cents.
Yeah, cents on the dollar. So if you're from the Solomon Islands or one of those places and you want to, why should you be forced to go to the Commonwealth Bank and pay $40 when you could pay $2, right? But because what the banks did, this is a couple of years ago, the banks went through and mass debanked all these cash remittance companies. They're not illegal companies. I talked to the companies. They abide by the same disclosure laws as the banks, and they abide by them better than the banks, right? CBA and Westpac both got massive fines in 2019 and 2020, or 2018 and 2020, for breaching these disclosure laws. These cash remittance companies can't afford those kind of fines, and they follow the law, right? So anyway, that's just this. There's been this wave of this stuff, and that's what they threatened Louis Christopher with. Just a threat. Tell us all this private information, or else. Okay, so that was Louis Christopher. Let me talk now about John Adams, friend of the show. Regular viewers would probably recognise the name John Adams. The John Adams has also recently become a victim of debanking. So John Adams is an independent economist, as you all know. He's also a bullion dealer. He has a personal bullion company called Adams Bullion. And he recently changed his business arrangement from being based here in Melbourne to based where he is in New South Wales. And that involved opening an account with ANZ. And ANZ, he made 2 sales back in April, just 2. And both to people that he knew very well. And in fact, I know them because I talk to John regularly. And I was briefed on this. And I know his 2 customers. And ANZ froze his account and refused to explain why. That was back in April, and has since fully debanked him, closed his account and his personal account associated with it. So they've closed his accounts and still refused to explain why. And that's one of the worst parts of debanking. The banks, especially the big 4, treat you like crap and they owe you nothing in terms of even an explanation. And there are other cases of bullion deals we've talked about in the past, where when they were debanked, they weren't debanked by their first bank. They couldn't get accounts at any bank. And they had to go through, one guy was telling me he had to print off, APRA? He had to go to APRA's list of ADIs, Authorised Deposit Taking Institutions, which is the technical name for a bank. And it's like, 100 names on there or something.
120 odd last
120 names on there or something, right? And he had to dig through and find the little ones who hadn't decided to debank him at that point, just to try and conduct business in Australia as a bullion dealer. Now, those are two cases of debanking. When Louis Christopher was asked about this in the media, he actually said this relates to the banks saying that they have to follow AML/CTF laws, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing laws. So the banks claim they're following the law, and there's a part of it called KYC, know your customer. So they're following the law. The banks claim they're following the law, right? So let's just park that. And the law is know your customer, and that's why they're asking these questions. Now, far more common than even that is this new trend in banking now, where if you want to, most people, if you want to withdraw hundreds of dollars, you go to an ATM. If you want to withdraw thousands of dollars, you go to a bank, right? And whether it's 3,000, 4,000, doesn't have to be a lot. Anything in the thousands, you go and get it over the counter. Nowadays, you have to give the bank notice that you're going to do it, because even though they're banks, they don't keep cash on hand, they reckon, right?
So they say.
Yep. John Dillinger is out there roaming around robbing banks still. Now, when you go and withdraw cash from the bank, what happens? You get interrogated. And this has really got up people's nose, right? Why? The bank says, what do you want the money for? And a lot of people's initial reaction is, well, why is it your business? This is my money. I lent it to you. A deposit means a loan to the bank. I've lent it to you. You're paying me back now because I'm withdrawing it. It's my money. It's not your money. Why are you asking me to justify what I want it for? Now, there's two reasons for it. One reason is the bank's claim is under this KYC thing, know your customer, anti-money laundering stuff. On top of that, the banks will say that the other excuse the banks will have nowadays is the scams.
Yeah.
Right? Now, if that's the case, if the banks were truly concerned about scams, they wouldn't be closing so many branches and forcing so many people online to be exposed to those scams, especially the elderly. So don't take that as gospel. And also, a scam, the best way to avoid scams is have regular bank branches, have bank branches available where you have a relationship with your bank tellers, right? And if you are the middle-aged lady who has been a widow for 20 years and suddenly you're telling them that you're in love with this guy online in Nigeria.
Yeah. He's a prince,
He's a prince. Oh, he's so wonderful. And look, he's just, we had this wonderful time online, and you're telling this to your bank. You're telling this to your bank teller, right? That you know really well, right? You're there for a chat, and something's happened. He needs a little bit of help. I'm going to send him some money. That's when the bank teller can say, Deirdre, if that name's still in vogue, maybe you should think about this, right? But what we're dealing with is just total bureaucratic garbage. So we're going to play a video now. A lot of you would have seen this. It went viral. This is from a couple of years ago. There's an an edgy comedian in Sydney named John Bernard Carews. He made a TikTok-ish video about this, put it all over the place, and it actually illustrates. Now, it is edgy, I warn you, if you're easily offended, but it's also funny way to illustrate quite a serious problem. Have a look.
When you withdraw cash in Australia, the banks want to know why, so let's go tell them the truth.
How much?
Around 6,000.
What is it for?
My missus thinks I cheated on her last week. She's doing my f***ing head in, so I need to give her some cash and a necklace. She doesn't like flowers, she just likes designer handbags and shit.
Sign there?
No worries. I don't know why it's important for the bank to know, it's money.
I have to ask.
I've got to go to a beauty salon to bleach my arsehole.
Yeah, there we go.
There's a bleaching package, and yeah, they say you can make it up to 3 shades lighter. Drugs,
Well,
The devil's lettuce, you would know.
That's what you want me to put, John Bernard?
I don't deal it personally. I just connect people together.
Whatever you do, it's
Okay.
your business.
What's the money for?
Yeah.
Does it matter?
We need to ask customer why.
I need it for steroids. Summer's coming up, Stereosonic festivals. I need a shred for summer. I mean, if you must know, I'm transitioning to be a woman, so I have to pay for the surgery. It's an expensive surgery. It's not covered on the Medicare.
Now, Richard, have you ever needed any of those services? All right. So, actually, I have to point out, it's clearly bureaucratic BS because the tellers' behaviour indicates it is. They're just going through the motions.
Yeah.
They need you to give them an answer that they can put down on paper, right? They're not there to give, so never take anything against the banks out on the tellers, right? They're wonderful people. They will help you under all circumstances. So, don't worry. Actually, don't let them sell you stuff on behalf of the banks. So, they're not perfect, but that's not the issue. So, anyway, here's why we're going through this. The banks claim they're following the law. They are not. Now, I want to give you a contrast to Louis Christopher. So here's Louis Christopher. Louis Christopher is already a well-known Australian in the business circles. He's therefore very well known to his bank already, and he's been a customer since 1978. He signed up as a school kid
The old Dolomites.
to exactly like I did. I'm a customer of the Commonwealth Bank and have been since I did it in probably, well, he said 78. I probably did it in 79, 80, something like that, right? And I've had a Commonwealth Bank account ever since. So he's well known to the Commonwealth Bank. And no, they sent him a letter demanding all this information with a threat. So yeah, they have rights under Know Your Customer. They have rights, but they do not have the right to go beyond that. They have rights to know what you're doing, but they already know what he's doing.
Yeah.
They don't have the right to go beyond that, except the right that comes with a take it or leave it approach to doing business with their customers. And when it's the Commonwealth Bank, and everyone says, "Oh, shop around with your banks, etc." It's not that easy
No.
to move bank accounts, right? So they have that over their customers. But here's the contrast. Recently, I was told firsthand this story about the Commonwealth Bank and Know Your Customer. The person who told me has power of attorney over a woman in her 90s. And this woman in her 90s has been a lifelong customer of ANZ Bank. Now, she's still functional, even though the person who told me has power of attorney. He's there to make sure that everything gets taken care of properly, but she's quite functional. She heard from her friends that the government's deposit guarantee only applies, the government's deposit guarantee is $250,000. Now, we know it's mostly rubbish, but it's $250,000 and it applies per bank. So theoretically, if you got $1 million, you could split it up between four
different
banks,
banks and have
right?
it all
And it's all guaranteed. So she heard this and she thought, oh, well, I better take advantage of that. And she took a cheque for $250,000. She knew where the closest Commonwealth Bank branch was, that she'd never been a customer of. She took a cheque for $250,000 into the branch, and there and then on the spot, they opened a bank account for her, and the only ID she had was a driver's license. That is not 100 points of ID. Banks have been demanding 100 points of ID since at least the 1990s, right? This was the gold standard of Know Your Customer identification. 100 points of ID, right? And that involves at least something like a passport or a birth certificate and a driver's license and a utilities bill or something.
Yeah. Well, I was asked for all that when I opened an account in the 90s in my teens, and I didn't have it.
Yep.
I got let off the hook because the I don't know if she was the manager or anyway, the lady that was running the bank that day happened to have gone to school with my mother.
And she still asked for 100 points of ID.
Well,
she provided she filled in the gap, did she?
Well, she'd known my family since before I was born, so.
Okay. She knew who you were. Well, banks can be flexible like that. And this is without, by the way, when we talk about the 90s, they didn't have these know your customer laws then. These have only come in the last few years. So this is Commonwealth Bank doing this to an elderly lady under these existing know your customer laws we're talking about. What it shows you is when they're the beneficiary, because she's offering to put a $250,000 cheque in their bank, right? When they're the beneficiary, they can be incredibly flexible. But in general, when it comes to the general public and the general customers, no, they're not. Now, what about when the banks interrogate you for what are you doing with the money? Well, it turns out they're not following the law there either. The law is enforced by AUSTRAC, and it's this thing that AUSTRAC fined CBA and Westpac for, which is the banks are supposed to all not just the banks, all financial companies that have reporting
financial
obligations,
services companies,
right? They are supposed to report all cash transactions.
All transactions, actually,
all transactions above the threshold, and the threshold is $10,000, and these are called threshold transaction reports. So they're supposed to have their paperwork organised to provide these threshold transaction reports to AUSTRAC. And it's like one of these things like, I shouldn't say this, I don't want to cause trouble, but you can compare it to the vaccine surveillance system, right? Where you just put AUSTRAC, the financial institutions are supposed to provide AUSTRAC a lot of data, like vaccine surveillance is supposed to just provide the regulator a lot of data about all the reactions to vaccines. And the regulator looks at all this data and they're looking for signals from which they can detect things going wrong, right? And AUSTRAC does the same thing. So the banks are providing all this data of every transaction over $10,000, and it's massive amounts of data, but they can number crunch that and they can look for signals and say, hang on, something dodgy happening here.
There is also scope for because everybody knows what that threshold is because it's in the law. So there is scope for the banks to report patterns of transactions below that threshold that suggest somebody is skirting it. But yeah, the disclosure threshold for the details of that transaction is $10,000.
And I looked up the rules. When Parliament passes laws now, they have the actual legislation. They often have regulations attached to them in the form of rules. And I tried to. The rules on this law were massive. And I went through them, and I couldn't find anything that's demanding to know the actual purpose of if it's cash withdrawals, the purpose. They just wanted to know the identification of the people doing it.
Yeah, it's like metadata on communications tracking, surveillance.
So when the banks are demanding to know what you want your money for, if it's below $10,000, it's none of their business. It really is none of their business. If it's above $10,000, well, they have the right to know something. And we're not doing this to encourage you to pick a fight with your bank teller there and then. That's not the point. The point is to understand that the banks are abusing their position. And then finally, the big one, debanking. This wave of debanking, it turns out this is definitely not following the law. In fact, it's not illegal. It's not illegal under the same rules that say, any business can choose who it does business with, right? The whole gay marriage debate about the
wedding cakes.
The wedding cakes, right? Should you be able to deny business, etc. And most people thought, well, no, the business has certain rights. Glad we don't have that debate anymore. But the banks, people say the banks have the rights to decide who they do business with. Well, we'll talk about that in a second. But it turns out the regulator that the bank's telling us that they're trying to abide by recommends against debanking explicitly. I'll read you the actual the thing on AUSTRAC's website. I'll get the producer to put this up. In recent years, some financial institutions have declined, withdrawn or limited banking services to customers in certain industry sectors due to factors such as commercial considerations, reputational risk and regulatory risk exposure. Debanking or de-risking can have a devastating effect on legitimate businesses. It also reduces the capacity of Australia's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing framework to prevent and detect money laundering, terrorism financing and other serious crime by discouraging transparency and potentially forcing customers into unregulated channels. So in other words, AUSTRAC's saying to the banks, if you debank customers, you're undermining our ability to detect money laundering,
Yeah.
right?
Because, big surprise, the criminals don't care about the law.
Yep. No, exactly.
You know?
So 2 final points about this, Richard. One is, yeah, businesses should be able to decide who they do business with. But when you talk about corporations, corporations are not mum and dad businesses where they've put their own personal capital into whatever, right?
Yeah.
Corporations are massive financial bureaucracies, and they've got, the people running them have no, apart from their own obligations to whatever they have to do to earn their money and their bonuses, right? Most of them, especially the modern wave of managers, have no consideration at all about the long-term health of the business or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
So the idea that corporations should have the absolute right to pick and choose who they do business with, especially when it comes to the most basic fundamental need of a bank account, needs to be questioned. And if you look at the big 4 banks in Australia, which dominate 80% of the financial system, 80%, they're that dominant, should they have the right to deny lawful businesses a bank account? And I think the answer should be no.
No.
They should be forced to act like utilities. Your local electricity provider cannot deny you business, right? And the banks should not be able to deny you business.
Yep.
And if the banks don't like that, we've got another idea. The Citizens Party's idea of a public bank, because it's a public bank, should definitely not be able to discriminate against anybody.
Yeah. Like that one that we used to have for 86 years.
Exactly. If it's a public bank, there should be no discrimination in any lawful business. And you may not like the types of businesses, but they're lawful. If you don't like them being lawful, campaign against that.
Yeah.
But do not give the power to bankers to decide who gets to conduct business in the economy and who doesn't. Right? That's a principle we have to establish here. And if the government isn't going to force the banks to stop debanking people, we should start a public bank. And we should start a public bank anyway.
Yep.
All right. Let's get on to something even more serious. What about Dan? War propaganda in overdrive. And we were talking about this morning before we started the show. I mean, this is really fired up, and I sort of detected around the time of the coinciding with the election in Australia. We're talking about an Australian phenomenon of war propaganda, but of course it actually relates to I suppose that did coincide with the Trump administration being sworn into pretty much, and you've got some mixed messages out of Trump, but they're not really that mixed if you understand the overall strategic agenda, and that is there are fights between the neocons who want to just fight everybody, including the Russians. Then there's these other people in the Trump administration who are saying, no, we don't want to fight the Russians. We want to reserve all our energy for fighting the Chinese.
Yep.
Either way, but they're all talking about a war, right? I've written here, when you hear, this is a message this is a rule of thumb for Australians, Richard. When you hear China, 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 what you should be hearing is cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. Because the people that are telling us China, China, China are the ones that are making money out of us, like AUKUS, as we talked about before. An example of this, so last week I interviewed John Lander, and you can, if you're on YouTube now, you'll see my interview there with John Lander. And if you haven't watched it, make sure you watch it. John's the former ambassador to Iran. He wanted me to interview him because he said, look, I want to say this. Even though Albanese won the election, and on some of this stuff he seems more measured than Peter Dutton, who just seemed to be itching to start a war. He said the election has actually edged us closer to war. And his reasoning was because the military build-up under Albanese is continuing anyway.
Yeah.
Right? And so he said that to me last Tuesday, sitting in this studio. On the weekend, Pete Hegseth, the US Defence Secretary, was at Shangri-La with Richard Marles, the Australian Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister, and frankly what Marles said in response to Hegseth confirmed everything John warned about.
Yeah. So this is the Shangri-La Dialogue. It's a strategic forum held, I think, every year at the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore, hence the name, hosted by one of these international strategic think tanks that's the IISS. That's
They get all the defence ministers together and they actually take pot shots at each other verbally, don't they?
yeah, on occasion. Sometimes some of the people who know they're going to be targets just decline to attend.
So Hegseth said a couple of things, Richard. In his speech, he said something that was just, actually, I'll just read the quote here. He goes, "We know that Xi Jinping has ordered his military to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. Let me be clear. Any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. We are not going to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real and it could be imminent." Response, please.
Xi Jinping never said that. No Chinese government official ever said that. This was fabricated by the Americans, and the explicit formulation about they're planning to invade in 2027.
2027.
Well, you know, let's just be clear here. China cannot invade Taiwan. Taiwan, by everybody's legal definition, including Australia's, the United States, and Taiwan's itself, is that Taiwan is part of China.
You cannot invade yourself.
This is the unfinished last phase of the Chinese Civil War that's been on the back burner, been on hold for since 1949.
So if China takes military action against Taiwan, what China's actually doing is resuming military hostilities in that civil war.
Yeah,
that's what it's doing.
Yeah,
that's not an invasion.
No, and you can like it or not, but that's the law. That is the situation under international law, as recognised by our government and the United States government.
So it's not an invasion. So it's not an invasion, and there's no evidence for this 2027 timeline.
They just made it up based on this being this is the centenary of the formation of the PLA. I think it was the People's Liberation, the Chinese army that was started by the Communist Party during the Civil War.
And this is a pattern that's been going on for a long time. Western analysts look at all these anniversaries in China, and they try and make predictions based around these anniversaries.
Yeah,
right.
And and as you said, it always boils down to, one, we've got to put a stick in China's spokes, but two, money, money, money.
That's right.
Pay us money. Pay our military industrial complex sponsors money so they can pay us more money because we did such a good job with the propaganda.
In literally the next breath, Pete Hegseth met with Richard Marles and said, "You must raise military spending, defence spending, military spending. You must raise military spending from 2% of GDP to 3.5%. Now, by the way, the Australian media downplayed this, and Marles downplayed it and said, "I didn't really put a figure on it. The media tends to report it as 3%. I read the American media report on it, 3.5% of GDP.
Yep.
What does that mean? Well, in real terms, if that was the case this year we're spending $56 billion on the military in the budget, which is 6.5% of the budget, 2% of GDP, 6.5% of the budget. If we raise that to 3.5% of GDP, that would go from $56 billion to $90 billion. And that is over 10% of the budget, $1 in $10 going on military spending. And what is this? And this is where Trump can be a mixed bag, but this was consistent charlatanism from the very beginning back in 2016. He came to office demanding increased military spending from all of America's allies. He didn't say America would reduce its military spending. In fact, he boosted American military spending. What does military spending actually mean in practice? Where does that money go? Cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching.
Yeah, because there used to be 8, I think it's down to about 4 now, basically major military contractors in the United States. And
decades ago there was over 50.
Oh, yeah.
And now it's consolidated down to 4 or 5.
Yeah, just like has happened here with competition policy since the 90s that reduces competition. And they abuse their market power and they donate money to congressmen to get into office to support the bills that give them more money.
Yep.
And on and on and on. And so, the names will be familiar to anybody who's driven around the Canberra airport.
Yep.
Because it's Lockheed Martin, it's Boeing,
Northrop Grumman,
and it's changed its name now, Raytheon. It's called something else now. I can't remember what. And then there's a couple of Eurotrash.
You got the French one,
Thales. You got Rheinmetall from Germany.
Right, and of course the British one,
BAE Systems. So that's where all this money is going. And of course BAE does business, with Americans. It supplies components.
Yeah, we wouldn't.
things like that. So
Maybe you could accuse us of being cynical by saying that, but we wouldn't say it if the original warning about this business model hadn't come from an American president.
Yep.
It was an American president, in fact, a war hero. Dwight Eisenhower in 1960's final speech warned against this very phenomenon of handing over control of your military to the military-industrial complex, where they can run wage wars for money, because then they'll always be in the business of war.
Yep.
Right? And the connection is completely shameless. So this is, and what was Richard Marles' response? Well, his response was effectively, "Oh yeah, well we'll have to look at that."
yeah.
Right?
Now, to his
All right.
small point,
Bit
in
of history here.
Albanese's-
Richard's going to give Albanese some credit. Go ahead.
Well, a small bit of credit, because as you said, it depends what he does versus what he says.
That's right. That's right.
But yeah, Albanese turned around and told the media, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. We'll decide how much money we spend and what we spend it on.
Yeah.
It reminds me a bit of John Howard, we will decide who comes to Australia.
Well, there's another comparison you can make to John Howard and which should be apt now. John Howard and what's his name? Fishnet Stockings.
Alexander Downer.
The last time an American president saber rattled this much over Taiwan, it was the Australian government that seemed to put it to bed.
Alexander Downer went to Beijing and made a speech saying we're not going to have anything to do with any American, any hostilities with America over between China and America over Taiwan, and that was the end of it. Because they literally cannot do it without us. The way they've set the system up and the way they've basically militarily occupied Australia. But all he has to just say is no, and it doesn't happen. But he has to say it and mean it.
And then to consider the effectiveness of the propaganda, the other thing that Marles said in response to Hegseth, by contrast to Downer and Howard, he said, what we have seen from China is the single biggest increase in military capability and build-up in conventional sense by any country since the end of the Second World War. What we want to see is strategic transparency and strategic reassurance provided by China, and an understanding of why it is needed to have such an extraordinary military build-up. Hello? How many bases do the Americans have surrounding China, including in Australia?
Half of Japan is a US military base, it seems.
They've got about 12 in South Korea or something.
Yep.
And they control the whole South Korean military.
Yeah. They've got, I saw some figure recently, they've got like some hundreds of thousands of soldiers surrounding China at these various bases, intelligence facilities, radars, naval bases to send in their guided missile destroyers that are supposed to penetrate. Now, China can defend against all this stuff. That's why they're freaking out about.
But also, China is the country that for the last 20 years has watched America make up lies to invade other countries, kill millions of people, and now that same America for the last decade has been obsessing about China. Well, what's China going to do? All the propaganda Australians get fed about China's military build-up. We've been at this long enough to remember that the first thing that they started making an alarm about was China militarising islands in the South China Sea, which started in 2013 after Australia agreed to the original escalation, which was the Marines in Darwin.
Yeah, and around the same time that the Gillard government, which Albanese and most of these other senior people in his cabinet were ministers in, were negotiating. It was Abbott got in 2014 and ended up signing it. But the force posture agreement that allows this US militarisation of Australia from 2014, Gillard and company did the legwork on that back then.
Exactly.
And that was when, and so basically we're going to turn Australia into what it was in World War II, right? The unsinkable aircraft carrier for a war in Asia. And so they responded. I said, well, in that case, you're forced, and they said so publicly. You can go back and find the speeches by foreign ministers and foreign ministry and military spokesmen from China saying, well, you're going to force us to modernise, to expand and modernise much faster than we were going to, our military capability to defend against the things that you're saying you're intending to do
Yep.
to us. So, cry to the mirror, mate. You know?
John Lander and I discuss there's things like the forced posture agreement, etc., at length in the interview. So have a look at that if you haven't already seen it. Now, related to this, part of the propaganda just becomes China bad, China bad, China bad, right? And so we had an example of that last night. I'm a little bit concerned for time, so I'm keeping an eye on it, but we should be able to go through this. Sky News, which are the masters of anti-China demonization, they ran a documentary called Chung Lei, My Story, which they made in coordination with the Australian Wrongful and Arbitrary Detention Alliance, called AWADA. I'll talk about them in a minute. But Sky News, if for those who've, like, a lot of the things that the Citizens Party's pointed out is that we had a great relationship with China until about 2015, 2016, especially but even up until 2019, you had, Scott Morrison said in June 2019 that Australia welcomes Belt and Road for the positive investments it can make in the region, this sort of thing, right?
He signed an agreement to contribute to it in third countries as Treasurer in 2017.
Exactly. Not just Dan Andrews wasn't the only one to sign a Belt and Road agreement. Scott Morrison did. We only ever heard about the Dan Andrews one. But then under American pressure, it all started to change, and the media front ran this thing, and all the media. Murdoch was as bad as anybody, but the Nine media has just sort of outstripped Murdoch. But Sky is Murdoch. So this is just continuing their propaganda. And I'm going to say some careful things about it because I want to be a bit nuanced here. So this was one of the propaganda organs, Sky News. But this AWADA Alliance was launched last year by ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And if you know them, and Richard here has been debunking ASPI since at least 2014, 2015, I mean, these have been funded by the Americans to pump out the worst anti-China propaganda.
Both by the government and by those military industry companies we were talking about.
So the AWADA members, and just to repeat that name there, the Australian Wrongful and Arbitrary Detention Alliance, that includes Chung Lei, who we'll talk about, Kylie Moore Gilbert, who was the Australian woman who detained in Iran. Sean Turnell, who was in Myanmar for 6 years, I think, and Peter Gresti, the Australian who was from the Al Jazeera journalist who was jailed in Egypt after the Arab Spring. Now, there's a few things we can say about these people, and I don't want to be so there's something interesting about Kylie Moore Gilbert you can mention, but Peter Gresti, though, Peter Gresti has proven to be an interesting character because he's described on their website as an advocate for media freedom. Really? So he's the guy who famously panned Julian Assange when Assange was in jail, and he said Assange is not a journalist. Now he and a whole bunch of establishment media did this, right? And this was a counter operation against Assange. That's not a guy who values media freedom.
No.
Right? Also, breaking news, and we're going to do more on this, but last year Peter Gresti met with the UK government to discuss the reintroduction of D notices in Australia, which are notices to gag the media.
Do not report on it. It's a wartime measure. Was a wartime measure that then continued after the war in Britain, and we had the same system here for some years. I think it was abolished back in the 70s.
Yeah, so these are famous in Britain, D notices, and he's in discussions with the Brits to bring him to renew him and to bring him back in Australia.
Yeah, he's
also what the hell?
He's also a founding. I forget the name of it, but there's one of these bodies that it set up saying that they want to be. He personally wrote this thing about how they should be the ones advising the government on who is and is not a legitimate journalist and should be allowed to, report on national security matters and this, that, and the other, right?
So I mean, look, we are cynical about this kind of formation, but let me now move to Chung Lei because I want to separate our cynicism from. If you watch the show on Sky News, you can't help but have sympathy for her personally, because what she went through, what she describes, was pretty appalling. Let me give you some examples. 3 days in a dry cell. Now, a dry cell is a cell that only has a bucket. There's no toilet, and you're only supposed to spend 24 hours on these things because they're supposed to empty you out in case you got any kind of drugs or contraband or whatever before you moved into something else. So this is where you're put straight after arrest. She spent 3 days there under those conditions, and in the cells next to prisoners were smearing excrement all over the place, etc. And she had to tolerate the smell, and it was absolutely awful. Also, 20 months in solitary confinement. And her Awada colleague, Kylie Moore-Gilbert, described solitary confinement as its own deliberate form of torture, right? Because that's what she said, it's deliberately used as a form of torture, solitary confinement. That's what Chang Lei, no, that's not what Chang Lei experienced. I did that deliberately. Those two things I just said, the dry cell and solitary confinement, 20 months solitary confinement, that's what Dan Duggan has experienced at the hands of Australia, an entirely innocent man who is still in jail to this day in New South Wales, having broken no Australian laws. Those are two things he experienced. 3 days in a dry, those are just some of the things he cited. 3 days in a dry cell instead of 24 hours, really, really excruciating conditions, and 20 months, 20 of his 29 months in prison have been solitary confinement. 20 months. What's the point? The point is, when you see a story like last night with Chang Lei and you feel immense sympathy for her, they want to twist that sympathy into, you've got to adopt their view that China is all bad and evil and we are all sweetness and light and we are the paragons of virtue and democracy and freedom. And if you take that step beyond feeling sympathy for Chang Lei, you're a victim of propaganda, deliberately crafted propaganda. Chang Lei did, her account was appalling, her experience was appalling. We're not here to defend the Chinese prison system, but what we will say is the Chinese don't go around the world lecturing the world on how they should run their prisons, like we do.
They don't go around the world demanding that everybody arrest innocent people because they've decided to fit them up for crimes, like what happened to Dan Duggan at the Americans' behest either.
Exactly. So they don't do that. We hold ourselves, the reason we condemn Australia more than China is, one, it's our own country, but two, we're part of this pact of the world that holds ourselves up as the moral standard. And when we are breaking our own moral standards, we have to highlight that. The Chang Lei, the documentary last night claimed that she was punished by China. Their narrative was this was punishment by China of Australia. It was China's way of getting leverage over Australia for the deterioration of the relationship in 2020. And when I heard, that doesn't make sense.
No.
That China had all these other, like if it's about the Australia-China relationship, which deteriorated rapidly in 2020, go watch the 2020 episodes of our show, we were screaming about it. They have their own measures, government-to-government measures, which they used, trade sanctions and the likes. After trying to explain, trying to get dialogue with the Australian side to say, this is what we're not happy about, and they were ridiculed for that. Everything the Chinese did in 2020 was held up as an example for ridicule, until eventually they lost their patience and said, stuff you, and they put on trade sanctions and stuff like that. So they had, the Chang Lei thing didn't make sense. However, it does make sense if you consider something that the doco did not cover. It did not, and it's relevant because we're talking about Chang Lei as a journalist. The doco did not cover the fact that in June 2020, 2 months before Chang Lei's arrest, ASIO in Australia raided 4 Chinese journalists who wrote for Chinese media in Sydney. And not only did they raid them at the same time as they did the Shaukat Moslamani raid. 60 Minutes, what's his name?
Nick McKenzie.
Nick McKenzie from 60 Minutes was there on the spot for that raid. The ASIO tipped him off for that. But it was the same day that ASIO raided these Chinese journalists and no one said a word. The media didn't report it, and the media probably might tell you that they didn't know, but I'm not sure. I don't know whether I believe that or not, if they've tipped off Nick McKenzie about the raid that they did know about.
Well, and remember, there's also, it's not a D notice, but there's a law that if you report on a national security matter, you can, journalists and their editors can go a row for that. So.
Yeah, exactly. So if China retaliated, and it's a big if China retaliated, it's much more likely the retaliation was for that, not the general deterioration of the relationship. And in fact, it was the Chinese government that eventually went public with the fact the ASIO raids had taken place, not our government and not our media.
Yeah.
And this was discovered 3 months later. This became public 3 months later. And for the Chinese government to go public with it, they were clearly unhappy that the way their citizens were being treated in Australia, right? And if there is a causal direct relationship, it's far more likely to be that, which is us not respecting the media, us not respecting human rights, us having a system where we can suppress what the media reports, all the things we accuse authoritarian countries of doing, right? And this is where, again, you can have sympathy for somebody, but look at the bigger picture here and don't fall for the propaganda where you're supposed to assume, oh, one side's all right and the other side's all wrong.
Like it was a
Right.
Tolkien novel or something.
Exactly. And just consider, we're putting out a statement today about this, where we're going to contrast, we're going to compare Chang Lei and Dan Duggan, and people should look at that and help us share it around. But again, we're highlighting this because it's definitely part of the wave of propaganda right now. And quickly, in the time we've got left, we might go slightly over time, Richard, but let's do it anyway. We have a very interesting update on the anti-Semitic terrorist attacks. What we were told were anti-Semitic terrorist attacks, the wave of them in Australia in late 2024, early 2025, which seemed to have stopped
Yeah.
for some reason.
Seemed to have stopped right after the New South Wales, Victorian and federal governments all ran through laws or expanded regulations under their emergency powers to crack down on protests against Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza.
So once they achieved those laws, the attacks stopped.
Yeah, it's quite a coincidence.
Now, as we've discussed on the show here before, the Sydney ones have now been shown to have been nothing to do with anti-Semitic terrorism.
Yeah.
They were set-ups by organised crime.
Yep.
Right? What you've done an update on this week is the Melbourne ones, especially the big attack on the Melbourne Adass Israel synagogue. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the false conflation of protests or opposition to Israel with this arson attack. In the 6th of December, this Adass Israel synagogue was burned down.
6th of December, okay.
Yeah, so the police are seeking information, help from the public to identify the suspects of whom they've got CCTV footage and other images. But they've acknowledged in the course of that these people, now I should just backtrack a second, it was never really plausible to anybody who knew how, any sort of background on this, that this synagogue would be attacked by some putative militant anti-Zionists, right? Because this synagogue belongs to a sect of Judaism that does not recognise the legitimacy of the state of Israel.
Right.
They're what's called Torah Jews. They're not political at all. In fact, this one, it's a small sect local here that's they're completely apolitical.
So they're not
Zionists. They can be. They're not Zionists. They're not one of these groups that vociferously opposes Israel, but they don't endorse it either. They just don't get involved in politics at all.
That's the first hint though, because if this was terrorism that was supposed to believe was probably related to Palestinian elements, etc., they would know that.
Yeah.
That these are not Zionists.
Yeah, the last thing that somebody like that, if they existed, would want to do would be to alienate Jewish potential allies, right? Not whether this sect or the others who are, sort of related and think along the same lines.
Yeah.
So lo and behold, the details that the police released,
Which took a long time to come out.
yeah. So this is May 15th. This press release come out. We didn't notice it at the time with all the other stuff we were doing, and then hang on a minute, what's going on
the
here,
election
right?
was on, yeah.
The election was on, and so forth. Which,
It's just been held here.
yeah. So they've said, we can put the article up, but the brief summary is they said this arson was they're still treating it as a politically motivated attack, hence potential terrorism, because that's part of the legal definition of terrorism.
Yeah.
However, they say that this car that they used, which they've seized since later in December, stolen VW Golf, was used in a whole bunch of other crimes around Melbourne. Everything, it had cloned number plates, so it was a bit harder to track. Everything from stealing petrol, the drive-offs.
Yeah.
You know, you pump your petrol and then just jump in and scarper.
Politically
and you've got a
motivated.
fake number plate.
Politically motivated.
Oh,
petrol
obviously.
stealing.
And arson of a nightclub on the south side of town.
Politically
that had
motivated.
absolutely nothing to do with any politics in November. And then on the same night, and it's unclear from their press release which happened first, but there was an arson and shooting. Somebody shot up a family home in Bundura in the northwest, in the north here, about an hour across town from where this synagogue is. Shot up a house and set fire to the car out the front on the same night that they did this arson of this synagogue. And so the police are saying...
Hang on, was it using the same car, was it?
With the same car.
The same car?
The same car. So the police are saying, well, we think it was probably, they're speculating, they don't have evidence of this. They say, well, we think it was probably a communal crime car. That was the phrase the Assistant Commissioner of the AFP used. That basically, like, it's being passed around amongst all these criminals, except then they said imply that they're not actually associated with each other and have, and neither are the crimes. So we're apparently supposed to believe that that these guys shot up a house and either went from the mosque to the house or vice versa, but swapped the car and the jerry cans and whatever they were doing to somebody else with whom they weren't actually associated, who wasn't politically motivated, to shoot up and set fire to stuff in Bundura, but then go down and commit the one attack that absolutely was politically motivated because Jacinda Ardern, the Premier, got up and lied a day or two after and repeatedly that this is confirmed terrorism and that's why we're cracking down on your rights to protest. And even the police commissioner, the AFP assistant commissioner, Stephen Nutt, his name is, when the media asked him, he said, no, this is not, we're investigating whether it was a terrorist incident. The obvious implication, saying we haven't confirmed that yet, but the obvious implication being that they're investigating whether it was more of this put-up job like Sydney.
And the end result is, in both states, we have the most draconian laws that we've ever seen when it comes to protests and speech, etc.
Yeah, and Australia has the most draconian laws of this type in the so-called democratic Western world already.
And the protest they were trying to crack down on was protests against the actions of the Israeli government, which now even many of the European countries that defended the Israeli government for more than a year have turned around and started saying, no, these are war crimes, this has to stop. And leaders of the Israeli body politic, right, heads of the army and other political party leaders are all saying these are war crimes and whatnot.
And sorry, an important detail that I should have mentioned is that if some, as I said, militant anti-Zionists, theoretically, were going to target synagogues in Australia, well, there are synagogues pro-Zionist, some of them quite rabidly pro-Zionist, pro-Israel groups, who held events at their synagogues defending and promoting Israel's supposed right to bomb civilians to bits in Gaza for a year and a half.
So why weren't they the target?
They would have been targeted.
The anti-Zionist
right?
One.
They would have been targets. If anyone was going to get targeted based on that motivation, wouldn't you think that that's who they would have gone after, not these apolitical people who want nothing to do with any of it?
And one last final point to make on this matter, Richard, is that one of the extraordinary things about the reaction to the Adass synagogue is there was political pilgrimages there made by all the political leaders, and then Rupert Murdoch himself turned up in December last year to attempt to be there as well and show his support. And I think he got the Herald and Weekly Times, which he owns, to chuck in $1 million or $1.5 million towards the rebuilding fund. But then during the election, both Albanese and Dutton made pledges that they would donate something like $30 million to the rebuilding of the Adass synagogue. What's this thing made of? I mean, this was virtue signaling on steroids, $30 million. Just to contrast that, last year, the oldest continually operating Chinese temple in Australia burned down in a fire. And it's been going since the mid-19th century. The government gave $133,000 to its reconstruction. Yet, when it came to this so that what they called as in their response to a wave of anti-Semitism, they went way over the top on all fronts. The laws, the rhetoric, and even the public purse, $30 million for reconstructing on top of the money that the synagogue raised privately through people such as Rupert Murdoch, which was many millions anyway. Go figure. All right, anyway, that's just an example though. We've highlighted that because there is this war front over in the Middle East is still raging. It's terrible. It's getting worse and worse and worse. And so much of what we've been fed about that is propaganda as well. That's not an immediate danger to Australia. The big propaganda is this anti-China stuff that's intended to talk us into participating in a war, basing it here, so we'll be the target in the Chinese, in the counterattack, right, and paying for it. Don't fall for it. Look, apart from that, last week we did a story on David McBride where we talked about please call the Attorney General. We must continue doing that, right? If you haven't called the Attorney General, email the Attorney General to demand freedom for David McBride, do so. And while you're at it, tell Attorney General Michelle Rowland to free Dan Duggan as well. We've gone over time. That's life. Thanks for hanging in if you're still watching. And tune in next week for more of the hopefully shorter Citizens Report. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Robert.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.